Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The Driver's Story. I want you to remember that the biggest threat to white hegemonic power is Black solidarity and unity. And even during our enslavement, when they forced us to turn against one another, which we epigenetically still remember today, that was still the biggest threat against them. I hope you enjoy tonight's video. I'll be back momentarily. The Driver's Story: Labor and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery by Randy M. Brown. We're on chapter 3, which starts on page 66. It's titled Big Men. When Moravian missionaries arrived on Mesopotamia, which was a sugar plantation in western Jamaica, they singled out as the key to their success an enslaved man named Matthew. He was the head driver. Matthew stood out because of his openness to Christianity, but the missionaries especially valued his influence among the hundreds of enslaved people on the plantation. The Moravians' effort to cultivate a relationship with Matthew paid off when, a few months later after their arrival, one of them became concerned that their initial candidates for baptism were backsliding. Matthew gathered them in his house one Sunday and encouraged them to get back on track. Several months later, the Moravians made Matthew their official helper. As one of them noted in his diary, he organizes the people very well. Men like Matthew were often recognized as respected leaders within the communities to which they belonged long before they became drivers. As the Jamaican slave owner Alexander Barclay explained, an enslaved man was often appointed to the position of driver precisely because of the influence he possesses among the other slaves. That influence, Barclay recognized, was gained, as in other communities, by meriting their respect. At the same time, becoming a driver, as with other intermediary positions in colonial regimes with stark imbalances of power, offered enslaved men additional opportunities to enhance their power and status. Focusing on the ways that drivers cultivated authority and exercised leadership, while keeping in mind that few enslaved people in the Caribbean were more than a generation or two removed from their African homelands, suggests that drivers aspire to be what many people in Africa and the diaspora called big men. The concept of the big man was based on the widespread African notion, both before and during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, that the primary path toward wealth, power, and status lay not in control of the land or other forms of non-human capital, but in control of people. Enslaved Africans in the Americas came from a wide range of societies that stretched from Senegambia to West Central Africa, each of which had its own distinct social practices and political structures. One thing they had in common, however, was the idea of wealth in people. In contrast to contemporaneous European societies, where wealth is closely tied to the ownership of land and other material goods, the most important and valuable goods in Africa were human beings. Wealth embodied in rights in people, the anthropologist Jane Geyer observed. lies close to the center of African economic and social history over the past 500 years. In the slave trades, on the one hand, and in political and kinship history on the other. Where land was abundant and people were scarce, political mobilization and social relationships often revolved around efforts to acquire, incorporate, and control other people. During the era of the transatlantic slave trade, when many African societies underwent a process of what one scholar has called gendered Atlanticization, big man politics became even more widespread and more important in Atlantic Africa and facilitated some men's pursuit of power. African leaders historically focused on recruiting, producing, and maintaining other people as wives, children, clients, slaves, and other sorts of followers. That is, they aspired to be big men. In doing so, they faced the constant challenge of attracting followers and preventing them from relocating or forming attachments to other leaders. One way they did so was to provide valuable services such as protection and access to desirable, often scarce, material resources. Big men also took advantage of their external connections, including those with merchants involved in the slave trade, to get foreign goods and services from beyond their own communities, which they could then strategically redistribute to attract and retain followers. Those followers were important for many reasons. They performed different kinds of labor, provided specialized knowledge, enhanced leaders' prestige, and helped recruit and produce additional dependents. Women as wives and as slaves were particularly valuable because both they provided their own labor and because they produced children, helping big men form extended lineages and kinship networks with large numbers of followers. On plantations in the Americas, enslaved drivers and other men obviously could not pursue wealth and people in the same way that they or their ancestors had in Africa.
Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here.
The cultural and ethnic diversity of the enslaved population gave drivers strong incentives to appeal to the most broadly shared understandings of political power and leadership, rather than try to recreate regionally specific political structures or practices. Drivers' slave status foreclosed the possibility of exercising political power beyond the slave community, and it placed severe limits on their ability to perform some of the essential functions of African big men. They could not wage war against rivals or, in most cases, enslave other people. They also lacked the authority to control their followers' labor and sexuality, and they had little power to protect their people from physical violence or sexual abuse, especially at the hands of white people.
Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here.
On the other hand, drivers' pursuit of wealth and people was ironically facilitated by the fact that enslaved people in the Americas were effectively trapped with one another on the same plantation, a very different scenario than in most African societies, where low population densities and widely available land generally meant that followers who were unhappy with their leaders could leave in search of new attachments. They make out like but Africa wasn't populated. I don't understand this. Anyway, While wealth and people and big man politics, like other African ideas and practices, had to be adapted to the extreme conditions of New World slavery, they can still help us understand drivers' social relationships with other enslaved people. Two aspects of those relationships stand out. First, drivers drew on the unique qualities of their official position, especially their connections to white plantation authorities, to offer valuable resources and services to other enslaved people they hoped to claim as followers. This was a version of what Africanists call extroversion. Second, in spite of unfavorable demographic conditions and other obstacles, drivers worked to create large, polygamous families by seeking marital relationships with enslaved women, producing children they could claim as dependents, and building kinship networks. Accordingly, drivers' sole role within the slave community can be understood, at least in part, as a necessarily modified form of a broad shared African political practice adapted to the challenges of surviving on Caribbean plantations. But the roles of driver and big man were both complementary and contradictory. How did drivers manage the constant struggle of balancing their need to satisfy their enslavers' expectation against the responsibilities they had to their followers? Leaders and followers. Being a driver did not automatically make someone a big man. Many drivers failed to earn much respect from other enslaved people, either because they were seen as too weak or because they abused their authority and came to be more feared and hated than respected. Other drivers, however, successfully cultivated strong social ties with other enslaved people and came to be seen as leaders. How then did some drivers leverage the opportunities provided by their official position in the plantation hierarchy and broadly shared assumptions about the responsibilities of leaders toward their followers to become big men? Drivers who aspired to be leaders drew on their intermediary status to offer valuable goods and services to other enslaved people. They negotiated with white authorities to get scarce goods, appeared alongside enslaved complainants in court, helped enforce unwritten rules and customary rights, and took responsibility for other enslaved people's interrelated physical and spiritual well-being. Taken together, the strategies drivers use to attract and retain followers suggest that the ways they conceptualized their relationships to other enslaved people were not only shaped by the labor structure of the plantation itself, but also inflected with African ideas about leadership. For drivers and the people below them, securing access to provisions, especially food, was particularly important in moments of crisis, as illustrated by an episode on Plantation, Mesopotamia, involving the head driver, Matthew, whose story began this chapter. In 1760, soon after the massive rebellion that would become known as Tacky's Revolt erupted, almost all the plantation's white managerial staff left to help fight the rebels. The plantation was left in the hands of a single overseer and Matthew. In addition to trying to keep sugar production up during an island-wide war, Matthew faced a more existential threat. His people were running out of food, Rebels had apparently raided the plantation's provision grounds, and the attorney was refusing Matthew's request to send emergency supplies of rice and flour. Having exhausted other options, Matthew decided to take advantage of a strong patron client relationship of his own and appealed to the resident Moravian missionaries. Several of the enslaved people on the plantation, he told them, had not had even a bite to eat. When enslaved people lacked essentials, drivers were uniquely positioned to negotiate with white plantation employees or slave owners who could provide them. In one instance, the members of a chronically underfed and poorly clothed woodcutting gang on the Berbice River turned to their driver for help. No clothing had been distributed for years, but the more urgent problem was acute hunger. When the woodcutters returned from the bush to their owner's plantation on Saturday evenings, they spent much of the next day reaping cassava, which was a staple provision, but were only allowed to take 6 cakes of processed cassava with them into the bush for the following week, a quantity that was inadequate for their support. They occasionally received some saltfish, but often went for several months without any. The women and children among them were in an especially precarious position. They received no allowance of their own and had to rely on their husbands or other family members to share their own scanty allowance. The woodcutters had managed to avoid outright starvation thanks to nearby indigenous people who generally supplied them with food, but who were now tired of doing so. It was then that the woodcutters turned to Adam, a 50-year-old African-born bush driver, for help. According to Adam, he was deputied by the gang to represent their mistress, that they were not sufficiently fed and clothed. One Sunday, before he was to take his gang back into the bush, Adam tried to negotiate with her. But instead of affording redress, she had him locked in the stocks. When 2 of Adam's supporters stepped forward to defend him, they were both flogged. Rebuffed by his owner, Adam had to find some other way of securing provisions for his people. One option, going to the colonial officials who usually ruled against enslaved complainants, was inherently risky and guaranteed to provoke his owner, the very person in charge of distributing the food that they needed. But things were desperate enough that Adam decided to appeal to the colonial legal officials known officially as the fiscal and by some enslaved people as the massa in town. Like other big men, Adam knew that even slave owners had to answer to higher authorities. Adam and 8 other men told the fiscal in great detail that they had long endured inadequate supplies of clothing and food, that they were frequently subjected to arbitrary and brutal violence, and that their workload was unbearable. Their legal acumen put the owner and the overseer that she employed on the spot. After the fiscal examined the owner, the overseer had to answer more than a dozen questions about provisioning and punishment before the Court of Criminal Justice. The fiscal determined that 3 of the major grievances Adam and the others put forward had been satisfactorily proved. They had been forced against the law to work on Sundays. They had not been clothed agreeable to the court's ordinance, and they were not sufficiently fed. He fined the owner 500 guilders and the cost of his investigation. Whether this punishment led to any lasting change in provisioning is unclear, but Adam had managed against all odds to get a powerful official to intervene on behalf of his people. This was a striking demonstration of how a savvy, courageous big man might leverage his access to external authorities to help his followers. A similar case came before Berbice's protector of slaves more than a decade later from a remote plantation on the upper Berbice River. The enslaved people there, like many of their peers throughout the Americas, had long struggled to get enough to eat. The little bit of cornmeal the manager gave his driver Abram to distribute was supposed to be supplemented by plantains purchased from another plantation. But the punt that delivered them was regularly delayed by up to 3 days. The consequence, as Abram explained, was that after finishing the corn, people would suffer at their work from hunger. Of course, this posed a problem for Abram too, since he would ultimately be blamed for any shortfalls in the output of the people he supervised. So he asked the manager to give them something in addition to eat. The manager refused and told Abram they would have to wait for the plantains. Soon after, 2 enslaved woodcutters, perhaps encouraged by Abram, traveled downriver to the colony of Berbice's capital, New Amsterdam, and appealed to the protector. They showed him a small calabash and ground Indian corn, which constituted their allowance for 3 days. The manager, responding to the complaint, claimed that the corn in the calabash was merely their breakfast, given each day during the 11 a.m. break, and that when the plantains did not arrive before dinner time, he distributed additional corn. Abram, however, contradicted the manager and supported the laborers he supervised, putting his very position in jeopardy. The 2 men who appealed to the protector, Abram said, had spoken the truth. The punt captain also corroborated their account, and in the end, the plantation's owner pledged himself that a better system of management should be introduced. The people he enslaved should never be without an ample supply of cornmeal, rice, or other provisions. A tacit acknowledgement that Abram and the others had a legitimate grievance and a customary right to better provisions of food. Drivers' ability to secure material resources for other enslaved people depended not only on the personalities of their enslavers or of the whims or of the colonial officials to whom they sometimes appealed to, but also on their negotiating skills. Those skills developed through years of practice balancing the competing demands of their enslavers and the enslaved people they supervised were put to the test during crises. One such crisis developed on a small coffee plantation of about 30 slaves in Berbice, where the longtime driver, an African-born man in his late 30s named McCrae, faced an increasingly recalcitrant labor force. The current problems had deep roots. For years, the plantation's enslaved men had complained, as one of them told the Fiscal 5 years earlier, that there were no women on the estate at all. In late 1826, having no wives on the estate became an especially acute problem for the nearly all-male gang when the owner reassigned the sole woman to the role of cook, from the role of cook to picking coffee. Ordinarily, enslaved men expected their wives to prepare meals and perform other domestic labor, which they saw as women's work. So they didn't have any women there. A man named Brutus was especially vocal in expressing his anger. On one occasion, he refused McCrae's order to clean the drains that prevented rainwater from flooding the fields, saying he would not do it unless the fiscal came on the estate. Another time, he refused to return a borrowed punt to a neighboring planter. Part of the problem, as Brutus saw it, was that the plantation's owner was illegitimate because he was not white but of mixed race. For McCrae, the most pressing problem was that the people under him were not picking enough coffee, and the owner knew it. Comparing notes with 3 neighboring planters one day, the owner found that his enslaved labor force was only picking a quarter of what other plantation slaves picked each day. McCrae knew that if he could not find a way to get the gang to work harder, he would be punished or perhaps even demoted. To get things back on track, McCrae attempted to negotiate an arrangement with the owner that would get the people below him to do more work, while he simultaneously showed them that he was looking out for their best interests. One evening, when the owner complained to McCrae about the progress of the coffee harvest, McCrae said they were very dissatisfied. But there were, he said, some practical things the owner could do to boost morale and increase production. First, he proposed that the owner reassign some of the field labor so that the gang would again have a dedicated cook, saving them from the time and energy that food preparation required. Second, he suggested the owner promise each Negro man a dram of rum for a full basket of coffee as an incentive. The owner immediately consented to McCrae's suggestions. 3 days later, everyone also received tobacco and pipes to further animate them. The fragile compromise that McCrae brokered seemed to have worked, at least at first. McCrae had no doubt boosted his owner's confidence in his skill as a labor supervisor and encouraged the enslaved field laborers he oversaw to be grateful that he had got them what they wanted. But 3 days later, McCrae pushed for another concession. He told the owner, perhaps at the urging of his followers, that it would be good to give them some additional fish in the field, exclusive of the usual allowance on Sunday, as was done on other estates. At that point, the owner lost patience with McCrae and decided to negotiate directly with his enslaved labor force. He went into the field and told everyone he was determined to ask 2 of his neighbors to come and see if they could not pick more coffee. He also announced a new balance of carrots and sticks. Anyone who bought a full basket would get rum. Anyone who did not would get 25 lashes. And if they wanted good and kind treatment, which he defined as the additional fish McCrae had asked for, they would have to bring 2 baskets of coffee every day. How things turned out for the owner and the enslaved people on the estate is unclear. But for McCrae, this must have been an embarrassment. He had tried to perform one of the essential functions of a big man, only to fail and be rendered irrelevant by the owner. Drivers also appropriated scarce resources for their own purposes, instead of sharing them with those in need. They risked being seen as illegitimate leaders and could face strong opposition from below. In one incident, a driver named King on a riverside woodcutting estate in Essequibo fell out of favor with the other enslaved people there. Instead of distributing rum and cane syrup that were supposed to be shared among the men he supervised, King took them for himself and gave or traded the rest to nearby indigenous people. After multiple complaints, the other enslaved people there persuaded the owner, who suspected that King had also been involved in the theft of goods from his own house, to act. He had King whipped severely and threatened to send him to the fiscal for additional punishment. Other drivers occasionally went to great lengths and took extraordinary personal risks to show their followers that they were trying to solve problems on their behalf. One such driver was a man named Primo, who worked on a notoriously brutal plantation in Berbice called Berenstain, which the British government purchased in 1817 to grow provisions for enslaved people working in New Amsterdam. From the beginning, Berenstain was plagued with problems, including its location far up the Berbice River. Some enslaved people were transferred there from New Amsterdam as punishment, and many people considered living so far from town a remote and disagreeable banishment. Berenstain was also terribly managed, and tensions between the resident managers and the enslaved labor force, as well as conflicts between the managers and their employers, led to the remarkable rate of turnover. By 1820, Berenstain was on its fifth manager in 3 years. The current manager, J. Dewson, was widely detested. Among other abuses, Dewson forced enslaved people to care for a large quantity of livestock, including some animals he claimed that consumed most of the food grown on the estate, driving the enslaved population to the brink of starvation. Toward the end of 1820, Primo found himself under intense pressure both from the enslaved people he supervised and from Dewson. In November, an enslaved woman complained to the fiscal about the extremely severe manager and the driver who carried out his orders. According to her, Primo, instigated by Dewson, treated them very cruelly. There was general dissatisfaction on the estate, and only one solution, she said: the removal of the manager Dewson and the driver Primo. Even though the fiscal was unlikely to intervene in response to such a complaint, Primo must have known that his situation was precarious. Meanwhile, he himself endured humiliating punishments from Dewson that threatened to undermine his authority in the eyes of the people he supervised. One day, in late December, Dewson unfairly blamed Primo for supposedly allowing another enslaved man to escape, and then had Primo whipped, tore his clothes, and locked him in the stocks during the whole of the holidays. Some of the others stood up for Primo and asked Dewson to release him from the stocks. Humiliated and embittered, Primo apparently concluded that his situation was impossible. He decided to make an explicit break with Dewson and publicly cast his lot with the people below him. Soon after his release from the stocks, Primo led a group of 10 enslaved people on the 25-mile journey from Berenstain to New Amsterdam, arriving at the fiscal's office on December 29th. He knew the mechanics of testifying before the fiscal, having been the subject of a complaint himself 6 weeks earlier, and about a year and a half before that, having appeared as a witness for a different driver in another complaint. This time, he joined the others in urging that Dewson be fired. Primo himself asked that the manager might be taken away or that he might be elsewhere employed. Everyone agreed that Deucin was impossibly demanding, cruel as a manager, who did not allow them enough time to eat or rest and boasted that he could treat them however he wanted. Like many complainants, they stressed that they had exhausted other options. The multiple appeals they had made to Deucin's boss, one man had gone to him 4 times, had backfired. Far from being chastened, Deucin treated them worse than before and claimed he had full power from the fiscal to punish them as he saw fit. Primo and the others emphasized that they had not made the decision to go to the fiscal lightly. As one man put it, he never complained before, but was now compelled, hoping that he may get another manager to live with. Several of the complainants issued an explicit ultimatum or threat. If Deucin continued as manager, one man said, everything will go on wrong. But if Deucin were removed, another man testified, everything would go on well. Another said he would not return to the estate if the manager would be allowed to remain there, preferring punishment in town to ill treatment on the estate. In the taking of such a strong stand in support of the people on Berenstein, Primo displayed the kind of leadership expected of a big man in a moment of crisis. In the end, the complaint failed. 3 months later, Deucin made a point-by-point rebuttal to the charges Primo and the others had levied against him. If anything, Deucin became even more brutal after such blatant resistance, as indicated by continued complaints of horrific abuse. His reign of terror, as one historian called it, continued until early 1822, when he was finally fired, only to be replaced by a manager who was arguably even more sadistic. Not long after, the owners abandoned the plantation entirely. Still, Primo had shown everyone on the plantation how far he was willing to go to stick his neck out for the people below him. Drivers also attracted and retained followers by taking on the role of judicial authorities who handled interpersonal disputes within the slave community. Even some white observers were aware of this role. In the words of Jamaican slave owner John Stewart, the headmen on many plantations erect themselves into a sort of bench of justice, which sits and decides privately and without the knowledge of the whites on all disputes and complaints of their fellow slaves. Those found guilty typically pay pecuniary fines. Such judiciaries may have been modeled on West African precedents where kings or chiefs dispensed justice in consultation with local leaders and elders. Some white plantation authorities worried that these courts exacerbated social tensions, a concern confirmed by enslaved people's complaints about what they saw as unfair sentences, and tried to eradicate them, but they were unsuccessful. Other enslavers actually legitimized such courts, but made efforts to supervise them and bring them into the open. Enslaved people themselves apparently valued this means of adjudicating disputes and punishing wrongdoers without subjecting their communities to the scrutiny of their enslavers or the colonial judicial system. For drivers, this role allowed them to provide another important service to the people below them, further enhancing their authority. However common drivers' role in adjudicating conflicts may have been, Given the secrecy involved, it was rarely documented. Some of the best evidence for this role comes from investigations into drivers' leadership in diasporic social political communities, or nations, which were organized in part to punish crimes within the slave community, and from cases where enslaved people publicly objected to a driver's actions and complained to people outside the community, that is, white plantation authorities or colonial officials. Given the extreme poverty in which most enslaved people lived and the material inequalities between people with different occupational roles or social ties, drivers were probably called upon routinely to respond to the accusation of theft. After a turkey and 10 chickens went missing one night in a Trinidadian plantation, an enslaved man named Jean Charles was suspected of having stolen them. The manager did not find sufficient proof to have Jean Charles punished, but the driver, Peter, and the watchman on duty the night the animals were stolen took matters into their own hands. Without consulting the manager, they went to Jean Charles' house, convinced that he was the notorious robber. Failing to find the turkey or chickens, they took several items of clothing, a blanket, bowls, glasses, and fowls as collateral. John Charles, however, left the plantation and made a complaint to the protector of slaves, which is the only reason this episode came to light. Another incident on a different plantation in Trinidad involved a series of thefts from enslaved people's provision grounds. According to the watchman, who was supposed to stay up all night to prevent thefts and other problems while everyone else tried to get some sleep, some yams were stolen one night, and the driver wanted the manager to make the watchman pay for them. Presumably, the owner of the stolen yams had notified the driver, who promised to make the watchman compensate him for his loss. The manager agreed with the driver and told the watchman that if he did not pay for the yams, he would flog him. The watchman, thinking this was unfair, fled and appealed to the protector. He complained that whenever any provisions were stolen out of the Negro grounds, the driver expected him to pay for them. The protector, however, agreed with the manager and the driver, telling the watchman that, as he was the guard, he was responsible for the grounds under his charge. For drivers, responding to such thefts was a way of protecting enslaved people's customary right to the crops they cultivated on their own time, as well as a means of resolving disputes that might otherwise escalate as the aggrieved party retaliated. Doing so thus reinforced drivers' authority in the slave community beyond the scope of their work as labor supervisors. The relentless illness that plagued Caribbean plantations presented drivers with other opportunities to provide essential services to their communities. Like some leaders in Africa, drivers sometimes took responsibility for the physical and spiritual health of their people. When enslaved people fell sick under mysterious circumstances or death rates soared to new highs, they felt especially vulnerable. Their enslavers generally responded with either indifference or with medical treatments that were ineffective at best. Under such circumstances, enslaved people often turned to spiritual healing, including a range of rituals and practices known across the British Caribbean by the catch-all term called obeah. Drivers were uniquely positioned to facilitate the practice of obeah. By the late 18th century, it was illegal throughout the British Caribbean, and its practitioners had to operate without being noticed by or reported to white plantation authorities. Obeah practitioners generally expected to be paid for their services, and especially in the divination rituals designed to identify the person or thing responsible for harming others. They expected the entire slave community to participate. Given their position in the plantation hierarchy and the widespread respect other enslaved people afforded them, drivers were the best people to solicit help from obeah practitioners, who were often outsiders, to collect funds to pay them, encourage or force other enslaved people to join in the necessary rituals, and they made sure that everyone kept quiet. As a result, in obeah cases that came to the attention of colonial authorities, drivers often played a central role. Two especially well-documented cases involving the use of a collective divination ritual known as the Minji Mama or Water Mama dance in early 19th century Berbice suggests a common pattern to drivers' involvement in it. In both cases, an unusually high incidence of sickness and death raised suspicions that someone was using malevolent spiritual powers or poison. White plantation authorities were oblivious to or incapable of handling the problem, so the drivers took matters into their own hands. They asked well-known obeah practitioners who lived nearby for help. When the obeah practitioners arrived, the drivers consulted with them about the situation privately in their homes before gathering everyone to explain how obeah would help. As one driver put it, bring things on the estate to order. The drivers made sure that all the enslaved workers helped pay the requisite fee and that they all participated in the rituals, which lasted for hours and took place over several days. They also tried to make sure that dozens or hundreds of participants and witnesses kept quiet. And when problems arose, drivers took charge of managing the fallout. For drivers, helping other enslaved people across the spiritual healing access the spiritual healing knowledge and practices they needed to sustain life was yet another way they established themselves as leaders within the slave community. Overall, the kind of drivers who became or remained big men stand out in part for their willingness to take major personal risks on behalf of the people they supervised. To be sure, many drivers had a range of other attributes that also encouraged other enslaved people to see them as big men, from physically intimidating size and stature to charisma and oratorical skill. But the most successful drivers also recognized that they had much to gain by deliberately working to secure loyalty, goodwill, and dependence of the people they supervised and lived among. Nevertheless, juggling their official role as planter-appointed enforcer of labor discipline with their unofficial role as community leader among the enslaved exposed them to dangerous risks. Marriage and kinship. In Africa and the African diaspora, one of the most obvious marks of a big man was a large family that included multiple wives and many children. African men recognized that one of the most effective ways to establish a large following was to seek out relationships with multiple women, including female slaves and wives. African men valued women both for the labor they performed and for their reproductive capacity, which allowed would-be big men to produce additional dependents in the form of children. As a result, polygyny was widely practiced throughout West and Central Africa, where it fed intense competition between men who pursued wealth and people. It prevented some men from becoming husbands and fathers, at all while providing big men opportunities to produce large families and extended kinship networks that tied them to their many followers. In Caribbean plantation societies, too, polygyny was a key strategy big men used to amass followers. As enslaved men themselves, drivers and others who pursued wealth in people could not enslave women, but they could and did marry them. Even then, the extreme conditions of New World slavery challenged drivers' efforts to establish marriages and build families. Many colonies did not even legally recognize enslaved people's marriages or kinship ties, leaving enslaved families vulnerable to the whims of their enslavers, who routinely split husbands and wives and separated parents from children via the slave trade. Rampant disease and high death rates also created chaotic conditions that made it hard for enslaved people to reproduce and raise children. For enslaved men, high male to female ratios posed an additional challenge. By the 18th century, on most plantations in the Caribbean and other slave societies with African majorities, there were many more men than women, which exacerbated male rivalries over sexual claims to women. And even when men managed to establish sexual or intimate relationships with women or became fathers, their slave status made it extraordinarily difficult to provide for their kin and to protect them from harm. Nevertheless, there is plenty of evidence that enslaved men aspired to marry and have children, and even exert a degree of patriarchal authority. Even clearer is that drivers were much more successful at becoming husbands and fathers than most enslaved men. On two especially well-documented plantations in late 18th century Barbados, for example, only about 15% of male field laborers had wives, whereas nearly half of all drivers did. At the same time, compared to field laborers, drivers had about 3 times as many children. Tellingly, enslaved men with other high-ranking occupations, such as tradesmen, were also more likely to be married and have children.
Greetings, Moana Haguziki and Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. And yes, Moana Haguziki, they worked hand in hand to remedy the problems and the ills of the plantation community.
What such men had in common were positions that gave them both high social status within the slave community and better access to material resources. The same dynamics that made it difficult for enslaved men to establish marriages with enslaved women made it especially difficult for them to practice polygyny. One problem was demographic. Where women outnumbered men, some men never managed to find a wife at all, and very few men could hope to claim multiple wives. Another problem was that white authorities, especially those who were Christian, generally saw polygyny as an illegitimate practice to be discouraged, if not outright prohibited. Drivers, however, again distinguished themselves from other enslaved men by their unusual success in maintaining polygynous relationships. Indeed, in some colonies, the only enslaved men with multiple wives were drivers. Strikingly, enslavers themselves not only recognized that some drivers had multiple wives, but sometimes even formally recorded in official records those relationships and the children drivers had with multiple women. Take, for instance, the kinship ties occasionally recorded on slave registers in the early 19th century British Caribbean, a time and place where colonial authorities and missionaries alike put intense pressure on enslaved people to embrace monogamy and the nuclear family. On one plantation in Berbice, a 46-year-old African-born head driver named Alexander had 8 children with his wife Juno, 6 children with Nellie, and several grandchildren. Another driver on the same plantation, also born in Africa, similarly had 2 children with each 2 children each with 2 different women, both identified as his wife, 4 children with another woman, and many grandchildren. Slave registers from St. Lucia, which recorded enslaved people's family connections in more detail than any other West Indian colonies, are even more revealing. On one plantation, a driver named Alex, who had been born in Grenada and was in his early 50s, was listed as the husband of a 37-year-old woman named Katine, a field laborer. But Alex also had a sexual relationship with another African woman named Celeste, a 64-year-old, also listed as a driver. Together, they had 2 adult children, Philip, a 26-year-old house servant, and Eleanor, a 24-year-old field laborer. On another plantation, a 48-year-old driver named Timothy Ewing, born in St. Vincent, was listed as the husband of Mary Ewing, a 43-year-old Mandingo washer, and also the husband of Delia Ewing, a 33-year-old Congo field laborer with whom he had an adult daughter named Sally. In addition, with a third enslaved woman, a 40-year-old Igbo hospital nurse named Jenny Ash, Timothy also had an 18-year-old son named Dick. The slave owners recorded these polygynous relationships and marriages and kinship ties indicates that even when let me start that over. Slave owners recorded these polygynous marriages and kinship ties. This indicates that even they recognized that drivers maintained long-term relationships with multiple women and extended family lineages. In short, enslavers acknowledged that some drivers succeeded in accruing wealth in people. In other slave societies, even when such relationships were not formally acknowledged by enslavers, they were probably commonplace, both because drivers wanted polygynous marriages and because they had a better chance of establishing them than other enslaved men. Other kinds of evidence confirm that drivers often had remarkably large families. In late 18th century Saint-Domingue, a driver on a large sugar plantation reportedly fathered more than 60 children. In 1824, a 47-year-old Creole head driver in Berbice, despite the colony's exceptionally high male-to-female ratio, had more than 70 children and grandchildren. Several decades earlier, according to a planter with holdings in St. Vincent and Grenada, one of his drivers had a family that consisted of more than 40 people. He also reportedly possessed property valued at more than 200 pounds, which hints at the connections between the driver's social status, relative material wealth, and ability to create large families. What, if anything, made the prospect of marrying a driver appealing to an enslaved woman? Well, for starters, drivers had greater access to material resources, including food, clothing, and shelter, that they could share with their wives and other family members. Such arrangements echoed African practices where big men used their access to scarce resources to attract and retain followers. For enslaved women, who often received smaller allowances of essential provisions from their enslavers than enslaved men, marrying drivers thus offered important tangible benefits. On one South Carolina plantation, for example, a driver's wife had plenty of provisions, cultivated several acres of rice and sugar with her husband, and raised a yard of poultry. Enslavers who made provisions for drivers in their wills sometimes included drivers' wives too, as in the case of Demerara planter, who left a bequest of 15 joes, which was Guyanese currency named after the Portuguese gold Johannes coin, to his driver Henry, and the same sum to his wife Isabella. The link between drivers' special access to provisions and ability to marry multiple women and maintain large families drew the attention of some white observers. One English visitor to Barbados in 1825 took note of a driver who had a much larger and smarter home than other enslaved people. He had a house with 2 large 4-post beds, looking glass, and framed pictures, as well as wine to offer the visitor. Reportedly, the driver had also begotten 12 children or more. A century and a half earlier, the prominent Barbados planter Henry Drax made an even more explicit connection in his detailed written instructions about the management of his plantation that we discussed in Chapter 1. Drax recommended that his resident manager make special accommodation for the enslaved man named Monkey Knocky, who served as head overseer or driver. In revealing acknowledgement by a planter of a driver's polygynous family and his obligations as a husband and father, Drax specified that in addition to Monkey Knocky's own diet in the house, he should receive an additional 10 pounds of fish or flesh, which he was free, wrote Drax, to dispose of as he shall think fit to his mother, wives, and family. For women, like Monkey Knocky's wives, such material advantages likely improved their odds for survival. Being part of a driver's family also offered enslaved women and children important intangible benefits. Scattered evidence suggests that in some cases, drivers were able to pass on their occupational advantages to their children, especially when they were married to women with high status occupations of their own, as in the case of Alex and Celeste mentioned above. One Jamaican family's genealogy, traceable over 4 generations, is illustrative. In 1786, an African-born driver named Qua and his Jamaican-born wife named Betty entered the archival record when they were purchased by the owner of Mesopotamia. the same plantation where the Moravian missionaries cultivated a relationship with the head driver Matthew. At the time, Qua and Betty were in their mid-40s and had 7 children, ranging in age from 7 to 22 years old, who were brought along with them. On Mesopotamia, they both held high-ranking jobs. Qua continued to work as a driver, a position he held before being sold for the rest of his life. He died in 1789 at the age of 49. Betty worked as a children's nurse for more than 2 decades. Their 2 eldest sons, Charles and Chelsea, managed to escape field work for the rest of their lives. Charles was a carpenter for most of his 20s and 30s before serving as a house servant for perhaps a year before becoming afflicted with rheumatism and listed as an invalid. His younger brother Chelsea worked for a decade as a domestic before a 3-year stint as a cooper, and finally, when he was 30 years old, a driver, a position he would hold for the next 23 years. Taken together, the material and social advantages of being married to a driver clearly mattered to enslaved women. When their husbands were demoted, drivers' wives protested fiercely, at great risk to themselves and their families, and sometimes tried to get their husbands reinstated. If drivers had qualities that made them attractive potential partners, they also had coercive power. As several historians have observed, drivers were more likely than other enslaved men to be accused of using threats and violence to pressure women into sex and marriage, and of outright sexual assault.
As Bwana Haguziki said, a marriage during slavery is what he calls little slavery. These women were hostages, and these marriages to drivers were by duress.
Usually, such incidents did not make it into the archival record, and when they did, the perspectives of the women involved are obscured. An imaginative account, not bound by the constraints of the archive about drivers' sexual predation and the ways that enslaved women responded, appears in Marlon James' book of Night Women, written in 2009. A novel set on a Jamaican sugar plantation at the turn of the 19th century. In an emblematic and disturbing scene at the end of the opening chapter, a 15-year-old protagonist named Lilith is nearly raped by a young enslaved driver. After fighting back with a pot of scalding tea and then hacking him to death with his own cutlass, Lilith struggles to manage her trauma. Despite having repeated nightmares and flashbacks, she finds a measure of protection thanks to other women, even as she faces the retribution of other drivers on the estate who at one point attempt to kill her. As James emphasizes, such incidents were part of a broader culture in which drivers physically and sexually abused enslaved women without the interference of white plantation authorities, who themselves subjected enslaved women to similar abuse. For enslaved women and girls, like Lilith, predatory drivers provoked fear and hatred in equal measure. A rare, detailed historical account of a driver's sexual coercion can be reconstructed from a series of incidents documented by a plantation attorney in early 19th century Jamaica. In this case, a driver named Napier was accused by an enslaved woman named Joanna of using Obia against her and her children in an effort to force her into a sexual relationship. Johanna was already married to an enslaved carpenter on another plantation, and they had several children together. But when Napier began to make addresses to her, she must have taken him seriously. She was no doubt aware that the previous year Napier had broken up a marriage between another enslaved couple after threatening to use Obia against them. Still, Johanna refused to leave her husband. She rebuffed Napier's quote-unquote courtship, but her husband eventually left her, perhaps because he was afraid of what Napier might do to him if he stood in the way. Even then, Johanna continued to resist Napier's effort to make her his own. So Napier ordered Johanna not to be with anyone else. He also made an explicit threat. If she would not have him, he told her, he would do her bad. Johanna recognized this for what it was, a threat to use Obia against her if she refused to marry him, and went to the head driver, who outranked Napier for protection. He reprimanded Napier and threatened to bring him to the attorney if he continued to harass Johanna. Several months later, when 2 of Johanna's children died in short succession and a third became very ill, she concluded that Napier made good on his threat. With the support of her mother, Johanna went to Napier to beg for the child's life. Napier acknowledged responsibility but refused to relent. Soon after, Johanna's family told the attorney about Napier's pursuit of her and recourse to Obia, and he punished Napier severely, not for sexual coercion, but for having used Obia. Drivers like Napier, who would have seen women as the most valuable kind of followers, knew that they could not pursue many of the methods they or their other ancestors could in Africa, such as warfare or enslavement, for getting female followers. Some of them apparently tried instead to coerce women into marital relationships, abusing their power and jeopardizing their status among the enslaved. Polygyny itself could also create tension between drivers and their wives, especially when a wife objected to her husband's efforts to establish another relationship with a new woman. In one 1799 case from a sugar plantation on Danish St. Croix, adjudicated by colonial legal authorities, an enslaved field laborer named Sally became distraught when she learned that her common-law husband of the past 5 years, who was an African-born man named Leander, had taken another wife on a different estate. Sally was unwilling to accept a polygynous relationship or tolerate what she saw as her husband's infidelity. Jealous and angry, she tried various tactics to break up the other relationship without directly confronting Leander, at least initially. First, Sally fought the other wife, even though she was bigger and stronger. When that failed, Sally mixed some marl into Leander's water, presumably hoping that the concoction would work as a sort of love potion, binding Leander to her and keeping him away from the other woman. Finally, late one night, while Leander slept, Sally set fire to his house, hoping it would terrify him and deter him from the other wife. After the fire, Leander and Sally supposedly lived happily ever after together for some time. But when Sally learned that he once again went astray and remained unfaithful, she became so enraged that she set fire to a cane field and confessed to Leander everything she had done to break up his other marriage. In court, Sally was charged with attempted murder, while Leander, who interpreted the water mixed with marl as an attempt to poison him, minimized the importance of his relationship with Sally and defended his right to maintain multiple wives. He had taken Sally as a wife for the sake of convenience, he said, and his other marriage had also begun a long time ago. Facts that he apparently hoped would make both relationships seem equally legitimate. Remarkably, white authorities seemingly accepted Leander's polygynous marriage, referring to Sally as his co-wife. They also sentenced Sally to be executed by decapitation, though her sentence was ultimately reduced to criminal transportation. Drivers' efforts to establish relationships with enslaved women also made other enslaved men resentful and sometimes provoked violent confrontations. Many enslaved men, especially those in lower social status positions such as field laborers, resented drivers and other high status men for enticing their wives away from them and for what they viewed as monopolizing scarce women. According to the missionary John Ray, who lived for many years in Berbice and Demerara during the early 19th century, enslaved men lamented that it was too much the practice for the drivers, head people, houseboys, and white people to get the women from their husbands because they can give them a few fine clothes more than the others. Similar tensions on Essequibo woodcutting estate, where the driver and head man, King, apparently asserted exclusive sexual control of the only woman on the estate, may have led enslaved men there to retaliate by telling the owner that King had embezzled rum and cane syrup meant for them, for which King was severely punished. White plantation authorities feared that such conflicts over sexual possession of women could be dangerously destabilizing. Consequently, as one French Caribbean planter explained, no matter how much talent a driver had, white authorities should not hesitate to demote him if he committed the unforgivable crime of targeting another man's wife. When a driver displayed such a dangerous abuse of authority, he needed to be given a punishment in front of the entire gang of the greatest severity. In line with such thinking, white authorities on one Essequibo plantation took the extraordinary step of selling a driver named Bacchus after a series of conflicts that culminated in 1831. Bacchus claimed a woman named Lydia as his wife, despite her marriage to another man named Jonas, with whom she had 2 children. According to the plantation's attorney, Bacchus took Lydia and forced her to live with and have sex with him. Bacchus himself openly admitted that he made Lydia his wife by force. The two cohabitated for several years and had 2 children, but their relationship caused a great deal of commotion upon the estate between Bacchus and Jonas. They were always quarreling. Things eventually became so bad that the attorney told Bacchus to prevent further disputes, which led Bacchus to complain to the protector of slaves about being separated from Lydia. For her part, Lydia reportedly made no complaint about Bacchus being sold, but since authorities did not solicit her testimony, we can only guess about her thoughts and feelings. What is clear from the crisis that Bacchus provoked is that drivers' efforts to claim women as their own sometimes undermined their larger pursuit of wealth and people by turning potential followers into enemies. Drivers themselves faced similar threats from white plantation authorities, who asserted their prerogative to have sex with drivers' wives. Such incidents confronted drivers with the limits of their authority, knowing that white men would not be prosecuted for raping enslaved women, and that they were all but powerless to protect their wives or assert their sexual claims. Despite the obvious risk, drivers sometimes stood up to white plantation authorities who sexually abused the drivers' wives. A driver on Egypt, which was a Jamaican sugar plantation managed by the infamous overseer and diarist Thomas Thistlewood, found himself in the fraught position of trying to prevent a white man from sexually exploiting his wife. Thistlewood's nephew John apparently expected a driver named Johnny to interfere with the nephew's new sexual predation. So he locked Johnny into the boiling house the first time he raped Johnny's wife, Little Member. For the next 2 months, the nephew repeatedly raped her. Eventually, Johnny complained to Thistlewood that the nephew was, as Thistlewood phrased it, taking his wife. Thistlewood reprimanded his nephew at least 5 times. He noted in his diary, not for the rape, but for targeting a married woman attached to a driver. But the abuse continued. Eventually, Johnny may have decided to get retribution. Nearly 2 months after the nephew raped Little Member for the first time, he was found dead in a river under mysterious circumstances. To Thistlewood's chagrin, the enslaved people on Egypt celebrated. Perhaps the most dramatic account of a driver's efforts to protect his wife from sexual abuse or reassert his exclusive claim to her comes from a coffee plantation in mid-18th century Suriname. The plantation owner, Armand, The plantation owner, Armand Thoma, forced himself on multiple enslaved women on the estate, shifting between them in what may have been an effort to mitigate their husband's rage. One of them was Eva. She was an indigenous woman and one of several wives claimed by Corydon, a driver. When it became obvious that Eva was pregnant, at the time no one knew whether the father was Corydon or Thoma. Corydon could not control his jealousy. One night, he went to Thoma's room and killed him in what turned out to be the beginning of an armed uprising and mass desertion. During the brutal reprisals that followed, Corydon was tortured and then killed, his body ripped apart by 4 horses. As fathers, drivers also faced the horror of watching white men sexually abuse their daughters. In one instance, the head driver on Mesopotamia, Matthew, the friend of the missionaries, was forced to stand by helplessly as a series of white plantation employees sexually exploited his teenage daughter Hannah, who worked as a house servant. 3 days after the death of Hannah's second mixed-race child in March of 1761, Matthew was anguished but powerless. He told the resident missionaries, the only white people around he could potentially see as allies, that he could never have said what he could have never said directly to his daughter's whites on the plantation were none other than heathens who were completely without God in the world and lived based on their carnal desires. The missionaries recorded Matthew's complaint but took no action. Indeed, they blamed him for what they saw as his daughter's sexual immorality. Them good Christian folk. Sorry, I'm going to keep reading. Drivers tried to protect their immediate family members from other threats, too. Some drivers did so where possible by appealing to legal authorities for help, as illustrated by the efforts of an African-born driver named Samuel on a small Berbice coffee estate to fulfill his patriarchal obligations to rescue his family from a desperate situation. In January of 1821, Samuel told the fiscal that he and 5 other enslaved people he supervised were so overwrought by their cruel master, an inexperienced planter who had purchased Samuel just over a year and a half earlier, that they were scarcely able to keep it out with him. Their owner knew very little of Negro work and treatment, assigning impossible tasks and then punishing people, especially women like his wife, when they did not finish them. They also received inadequate provisions, nothing but a small piece of pork, a little fish, 2 pipes, and some tobacco. Nothing else, no clothes or anything more. Samuel knew, he said, that he and his family would be able to please a reasonable master. So casting himself in the role of a big man responsible for his immediate, Samuel asked that he, with his wife and brother, might be sold. While the fiscal had no authority to order a slave owner to sell anyone, Samuel eventually got what he wanted. In September, his owner sold him and everyone else on the estate. Drivers also fought, sometimes successfully, to keep their families intact despite the pervasive threat of separation by sale. In one instance, the manager of several cotton plantations in Berbice wrote to the absentee owner who employed him that he had recently purchased several new people, including an exceedingly good driver who was not willing to separate from his wife and 3 young children. That the manager was willing to respect the driver's kinship ties in order to obtain a skilled, experienced driver suggests that at least some drivers leveraged planters' reliance on their expertise and skill for their own benefit. Despite their best efforts, drivers were severely constrained when it came to protecting their families from harm, as underscored by the fact that they were often forced to use physical violence themselves against their own family members. The archives of Atlantic slavery are full of accounts in which drivers had to whip, beat, or otherwise torture their children, siblings, parents, and wives. Enslaved laborers knew that drivers were not ultimately, or at least solely, responsible for most of the violence they inflicted. Still, such acts must have strained drivers' relationships with their families and the wider communities in which they lived. Drivers' efforts to protect their kin, provide for their dependents, and especially to establish large polygynous families suggest that African ideas about wealth in people and kinship persisted in American slave societies. In seeking the social roles of husband and father, drivers also resisted the pervasive threats slavery posed of natal alienation and social death. Under the logic of partus sequitur ventrium, or offspring follows the womb, the legal doctrine that a child's legal status followed that of the mother rather than that of the father, enslaved people's paternity was often obscured or erased outright. So it don't matter who your daddy was, whether it was the slave owner's cousin, or the enslaved person themselves. Who was your mama is what mattered. Yet surviving records reveal that drivers saw the link between a father and his children and the connection between a husband and his wife as socially meaningful, and that they managed to get other people, including their enslavers, to recognize the legitimacy of such ties. Even so, the kinds of big man politics in West and West Central Africa could not simply be maintained or recreated wholesale under the violent, exploitative conditions enslaved people endured in the plantation-based slave societies of the Americas. Even when drivers managed to build large families or amass many followers, whatever wealth and people they possessed was overshadowed by the brutal logic of racial capitalism, where enslaved people were legally and financially treated as laborers and property. Nothing better illustrates the unresolvable tension between a driver's official role as enforcer of plantation discipline and unofficial role as big man than an incident on the Salt Spring Sugar Estate in Jamaica toward the end of 1831. One Friday morning, about a week before Christmas, the overseer flogged an enslaved woman for stealing sugar cane, then ordered the head driver to flog her a second time. The driver was the woman's husband, and he refused. In taking such a bold stand, he explicitly put his duty toward family above his obligation as driver. Even more remarkable was the reaction of the other drivers, who also refused to whip the woman. In a courageous display of personal loyalty to the head driver, the panicked overseer, anxious to regain control, went to nearby Montego Bay for help and returned to the estate with two magistrates. There they were met by the whole body of slaves, men and women, who had united in open defiance. Backing the drivers, the other enslaved people brandished their cutlasses, took possession of the magistrates' mules and pistols, beat the magistrates, and even threatened to throw the overseer into a vat of boiling cane juice. Rumors of a general strike had been circulating in the region for some time, and before the Salt Spring people forced the magistrates back to town, they declared that after New Year's Day, they would no longer work for their enslavers. 50 militia members were dispatched to the estate to resolve order, but when they arrived on Salt Spring, they found the estate deserted. Everyone had fled to the hills. A week and a half later, enslaved laborers across Jamaica launched what became the largest slave rebellion in the Caribbean since the Haitian Revolution. He doesn't name he doesn't name it. Some drivers clearly achieved a certain esteem and legitimacy that transcended their official role as planter appointed labor supervisors, but there were sharp limits to how much drivers could do when it came to providing resources, protection, and leadership for their followers and families without jeopardizing their relationships with enslavers, who could demote them or even worse. The most successful drivers presumably managed to walk the knife's edge of convincing white plantation authorities they had a driver who was working people as hard as possible while also making other enslaved laborers feel as though they had a protector or a leader and not just a taskmaster. Often, however, the competing demands enslaved laborers and enslavers made on drivers exposed the irreconcilable gap between being at once a driver on the one hand and a big man on the other. While some version of wealth and people and big man politics endured in American plantation societies, at least as ideas or frameworks, the severe constraints drivers and other enslaved people faced limited their practical applications. Mm, mm, mm.
So as you can see, at every point, they make attempts to destroy our kinship ties and connections. Even with the big men, the men that they entrusted on the plantations to beat us, to keep us organized, and to discipline us, they destroyed their kinship ties. Only when it was seen as profitable for them to keep those particular people in place and their families in place did they have any respect or acknowledgement of these polygamous families that these drivers were creating. And these drivers were allowed to create polygamous families because it was profitable to the enslavers. Because if the driver could be used as a breeder, then he could make money. It was like printing money for these slave owners. We should also note that the author talks about the socio-political organizations and structures that Black enslaved people had on the plantation. They had these structures in place in an attempt to reclaim and remember what they knew of Africa, what they knew of their homeland, what they knew of their countrymen. They had these opportunities. They had these opportunities to continue the understandings of the world that they had in African societies. Greetings, Bawana Haguziki. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good, good, good. In your reading tonight, I'm hearing so many parallels that of the slave driver and modern society. There's so many different parallels I can mention. From let me start with the relationships where the slaver or the slave driver he had polygamous relationships, and that kind of became a culture. Maybe we brought it from Africa, maybe we did. Who knows? Maybe because the driver had so many resources, the you know, many women would look to that and say, "Well, hey, this person would possibly be able to help my children or help me have children in the future and going forward. So let me stick to him." And multiple women did that. Whether I don't know if you could say dispute the fact that that culture came from Africa and we kind of continue that behavior, or it's because of the circumstance. So I understand where that culture actually came from, where we have this tendency, not all of us, of what do you call it? Uh, Womanizing. That's the term. Womanizing, having multiple partners. That feature was in that book. Also, when you talked about the relationship where the driver was kind of playing politician between the people and his masters, his paymasters. Well, you see that today. They change the name from the drivers to MPs. They now take on names like members of parliament, members of parliament. So they go throughout the constituencies and they placate the people because they have influence over the people. But ultimately, they have bosses as well. They have people who they have to answer to. But this is what you really don't see, and it's interesting. The drivers walk this fine line of playing politician way back when, vacillating between two worlds. So you see a parallel. I could see a clear parallel in the circumstance that I currently reside in, that we see many of these slaves still who actually still exist, and they could be very hostile and extreme. Sometimes they could be benevolent to the people. Sometimes they could be very two-faced. They just change names. Also, the the issue of the Obeah men, that's a feature that I was unfamiliar with because I really didn't know they work hand in hand with the government. But even so, the spiritual men of these constituencies or these neighborhoods, the the now they call them pastors and things of that nature. See, still have a lot of Obeah men walking around here, but now they call them pastors. They put down the root work and they pick up the cross, but they still working hand in hand with the government, and they still playing these two-faced roles where you don't necessarily know of whether they're with the people or they with the powers that be, who don't really give a damn about the people. So I find that these features to be fascinating. I see so many different parallels as you go through and explaining the the um the different features of the plantation itself. These things still exist, man. These things still playing out today, but the names have changed. The names change, but the actions still continue. What you think about that?
I think that's absolutely true. One of the things that I highlighted in the very first episode of this particular series was that the drivers are the middlemen, and that hasn't changed since they instituted the drivers. Um, they still have, like you said, Obeah men. They still have MPs and politicians and these political movers and shakers, these people that vacillate between two worlds. These these things continue to exist in our societies today. Nothing has really changed. They simply changed the names and took the chains off. But we put ourselves in chains because of the limitations we place on ourselves and the different things that we will and will not try to do to maintain our own autonomy. Like we don't grow our own food anymore. Like at the point that they told us we didn't have to grow our own food, it's almost like we stopped growing our own food. At the point they told us we didn't have to do these different things to survive, we stopped doing them to survive. We stopped relying on community and different things like that. But yes, those roles still exist to this very day, and they function very much in the same capacity that they functioned previously, but they simply changed the names.
No, I think they actually do still function the same way. Man, the British have done an excellent job. I gotta say, they watch our asses and how we uh, created informal ways of collectively getting together and organizing, and they just
Mhm,
put a name to it. They just put a
mhm,
name to it, and it's a fascinating. Yeah, you also mentioned in terms of organization how the slavers used to collectively get together among the people, and in some of these communities, sometimes it's not only the MPs that's working who's playing the politician. In Jamaica, they have this thing called a dunman. I don't know if you ever heard about that, but these are prominent people who may be known within a community, and they have the power of influence. So the politician may not necessarily go to the people directly. They work with their middlemen. So that middleman would be a dunman. In the Bahamas, we call them a quote unquote general. These informal people who have influence throughout the communities, and influence so much so that they could get people to actively do. And I find it fascinating that uh, back in the day, the slavers used to get up, used to organize themselves informally in the same kinds of way that we currently do, the same kinds, practice the same kinds of action. It's a weird feature, man. As you read this thing, I'm seeing the parallels as you read it. It's just crazy. It's a crazy thing, man.
Yeah, it is a crazy thing. And we have aldermen and we have community organizers and we have, of course, the pastors that are able to mobilize members of the community and influence them to vote for a candidate or support a political cause or do different things in the community to get different actions done based on what the powers that be paid them to promote. Because oftentimes those donations that organizations get, like there are several organizations here in Metro Detroit that receive grants. Well, when they receive those grants, they can't be as radical as they say that they are or as radical as they want it to be. They now have to toe the company line. So they have to now support whatever the political powers that be tell them to support. They can't act out. They can't protest. They can't do different things that they used to do when they were first a grassroots organization supported by the people.
Absolutely, because a borrower is always a slave to the lender. A
Hmm.
borrower is always a slave to the lender, naturally. But you also mentioned the marriages, and I, as you would have mentioned, you call it a little. Well, I mentioned I call it little marriages or little slavery, little
Hmm.
forms of slavery, because I don't see a person who is enslaved given any kind of consent. It's not a consent kind of situation. So I don't understand why we deem that relationship as a marriage. It's not a marriage. It's a marriage under duress, and a marriage under duress is a hostage. It's really a hostage situation. Yeah, but they don't call it that. They change. They continuously change in the language. I don't know why to not call something what it actually is. Maybe it's to confuse people, to see something different than what it actually is. That's why these old former slave colonies, to me, they still running like plantations. But I guess we call it parliamentary democracy now. We changing titles, but it's fundamentally the same thing at its core. When you really look at it at its core, it's fundamentally the exact same thing.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, they call it marriages in an attempt to confuse you and in an attempt to humanize some of these relationships. Because he even went on to say in the text that drivers forced women to marry them or forced women to be with them. And we saw in Thistlewood how certain drivers forced women to be with different drivers and different enslaved men through violence and through power and control of resources. Did they uphold these quote unquote relationships or connections? And these relationships and connections only benefited the owner because once two people got together, they produced and created more enslaved people. And the driver got his influence improved and increased by having more children because the expectation was that any children that he had would also be loyal to him because they would see him as their provider. Now, these women, you have to remember, women got smaller ration portions if they got ration portions at all from the enslavers. So their entire sustenance was contingent upon them being connected to this driver who had access to more food, more resources, more clothes, more liquor, more whatever in an attempt for them to survive. So these relationships were really survival strategies and techniques. Like you said, they were hostages. It was marriage by duress.
No, but and I understand why the women would fight so hard if the slaver got demoted. It's like that's like taking a pay cut. You know, when you come over, you want to tell you, well, I got demoted today. She's the one who's out there in front fighting for his job, for his job.
Hmm.
But how you define that scenario when you said that the person, it is basically kidnapping. It's kidnapping, and you call it, well, he forced her to marry him. You see how that language changed, but it's kidnapping in today's society. It's kidnapping, and rape too, because the woman, she didn't go by consent, and you having children with her. What's that? But like I say, this is a good reading. I just find it fascinating how the language changes. In the last book, we mentioned the little marriages that Thistlewood had to the women he was with, and it continues. It continues with the naming and the languages. But I don't know. I just think that it's good to call something for what it actually is, because sometimes you don't really know what you're looking at until you're really looking at it properly, under certain context.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that happens when we read these books is we're able to call out this was rape, this was kidnapping, this was hostage holding, this was abuse. These relationship dynamics that they're presenting to us in this pseudo romanticized way are actually acts of violence. And these are actual harmful dynamics that these people lived under, but they had to cope, and this is how they coped. And this author is making an attempt to clean it up, to say, oh, it was this or it was that, in an attempt to hide and shield, as Harriet Beecher Stowe talks about in A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, how the author hides and shields the ugly parts of what was actually going on in a slave society or in relationship dynamics. But I think that that does us a disservice, because especially in the modern era, we are more susceptible to being open to these types of relationships again and these situations again, if we don't name them for what they actually are.
Yes, yes. So it's not black girls winter or summer. It's not. Nah, you chasing that for resources. But needless to say, what did I want to say? I wanted to say one last thing before I went. Ah man, it's out of my head right now, Matron. But like I say, thank you for your reading. It was it's a fascinating read. I gotta say. I mean, it's a very fascinating read in terms of the functions of the enslavers, or the drivers and their thought processes, and also too is it's interesting how black people, some black people, not all, when they could find the ability to take advantage over their black brothers, some people will engage in these kinds of things. I think that you mentioned before the fact that in the Caribbean they did have slave masters who are black, just like me and you, and
Mhm.
that is an unconscionable thing to think about. But some slavers or some black men who have positions of advantage, they would they would take advantage of their own people. They would take advantage, and it happens all the time. And I think that sometimes we romanticize it and say, well, oh, they were just what do we think? They were just getting their children back. This is the words we use. They were just trying to adopt their children or get their children back or get their wives back during slavery. That's why it would seem that you had black slave masters in the Caribbean. Not always so. You had black people who saw slavery as an advantage for them, so they wanted to impose their will and power over other black people as well, in an evil, demonic way. What you say? You say one driver left and another one who came in, he was worse than the other one before. And you still have black men like that today. But I find also, this is what I wanted to see. Am I talking too much, Matron? You can let me know.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay. So the female enslaver, the female plantation owner, because I am sure that a plantation owner who was a male would have left his estate to women. And I don't necessarily hear much of those stories in terms of them engaging in rape of the men on the plantation, them imposing their sexual appetites because Thistlewood Thistlewood had a gender pair. I'm sure he had an old white woman who was trying to get her jollies off, trying to impose her sexual appetites with the black men on the plantation as well.
Yeah, I agree. And we don't they don't talk about that because first of all, these are white people writing the books. And they're going to shield their genteel white woman from being exposed for what she really was, which was also a depraved, sex craved individual. Additionally, if you had to be a woman of a certain age beyond breeding years, beyond, reproductive years to participate in in slave life with enslaved men in that way. Because if you got pregnant, right, the consequences were things like 50 lashes, or you yourself could be sent off to a plantation to work, or you would become an indentured servant, or you would be put in some other perilous situation if it was found out that you were having sex with enslaved men or black men in general, and put in this position where you created this mixed race child. So the consequences were different for women as well.
What do you think? You mentioned earlier in your reading that there were not enough women, and
Mhm.
some well, I guess the slavers were complaining that there were not enough black women. So what do you think came out of that scenario? Because if all the women, the available women, I guess, were marrying and getting into relationships with the driver, where does that leave the men in the plantation?
Well, we know that that leads to some level of sexual deviancy, homosexuality. That leads to sharing women willingly or unwillingly, like the one that wound up killing the man that was also sleeping with his perceived woman. You would think that that would put women in a more empowered position and situation, but they were just scarce, and they were just liable to be taken by the strongest, most powerful man that was in their plantation environment. But I think that led to some acts of homosexuality. I think that that led to some acts of sexual deviancy, because as human beings, we're sexual creatures, and we have a need and a desire, at some points in our lives to get off. I don't know if any one of them necessarily became eunuchs, but I think that that's where some of the Christian doctrine may have helped and come into play, because it would teach them things like not to have sex unless they were married. And since they couldn't get married, then they retained, I guess, like semen retention practices or different
Good
things
luck
like
with
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But that's all I really had for you tonight, Matron. Like I said, I appreciate your reading once again. It is a fascinating read, I gotta say. And I had to take some time out to listen to what you had for me tonight. But I appreciate you, Matron.
Well, thank you so much, Bwana Haguziki. I do this for you guys. I hope that you enjoy the readings and the text. These are subjects that we don't talk about very often, And something else I wanted to point out, the enslaved people had less respect for a black slave owner than they did for a white slave owner. So, one of the things that happened in this plantation economy and this dynamic was that if you had a black or a mixed race master, you saw them as less than the white master. And I found that to be an interesting dynamic in these relationships, because some people wanted to be sold off from up under the black or mixed race enslaver. Some people wouldn't work as hard for this black or mixed race enslaver. Some of them challenged this black or mixed race enslaver and their drivers more often. So there was more violence on those plantations. And I'm wondering if it's because psychologically they have been indoctrinated into the idea that white people and the Fiscals had the divine power of God behind them. And if you were black in this environment, you couldn't have that same power behind you.
Oh, this idea of the white man ice is cooler. That goes back. That's an
Yes.
old idea that, and that's something that we have kept. Unfortunately, that's something that we have kept. And I think that you really have to go through an exercise of reprogramming. And that's why I always say, we have these discussions, that reparations can't stop at a dollar amount, because there's some psychological effects that's happened to the black man in this part of the world and woman that needs to be recalibrated. It can't stop at a dollar value. It goes deeper than that. Because if you have the concept of the white man ice is colder, if you get $1 million, what are you gonna do? You're gonna go back and give it right back to
That's right.
naturally. Why? Oh gosh, why? Oh gosh. These things are very difficult, when you read these things, because I understand context and I see parallels, and me personally, I try to ignore the plantation but I could see it. I could see it and I understand it to a degree that many others may not. Because as you read, I see so many different parallels. But what do you do? What do you do? What am I gonna do?
Yeah,
So because I'm
well,
one person. I'm one person, Major. What are you gonna do? You know?
yeah, I mean, it starts with making the decision, having the understanding and knowledge that you are on the plantation and that the plantation never really went away. They just changed some of the names. Now you have to earn money, okay? But you can also do things like raise your own food and stop giving them so much of your money. You can change your appetites, meaning you can decide, I don't necessarily need not the modern comforts, but I don't need so much of the consumer based high end designer goods that they advertise toward Black people by making it popular because we make things popular for the larger society. I can turn my back on those things. I can decide to try to build community within my community. That's one of the things that I think we're all working towards is trying to build community within our neighborhoods with the other Black people that we live around. Um, and these small acts are acts that have long lasting impacts. Now, yeah, you can't quit your job. Nobody can, but we can decide, we can organize with our coworkers to arrange for better working conditions, just like the enslaved people did. Because one of the things we talked about last week was that enslaved people often had organized, unionized rebellions in an attempt to get better working conditions and more provisions allotted to them instead of just accepting whatever the master or the driver or the fiscal said. They often organized in these strategic ways to get better conditions. And we can do that right now today. Until we get a Black nation that is a Black nation that is one where we can be safe and secure, that is operating and organizing outside of the white power structure, we can organize and unionize today within the communities that we reside in an attempt to have better conditions and to negotiate better conditions on the plantations in which we live.
I actually agree with that. And you mentioned tastes. You mentioned tastes. And I in your reading, what you said is that the women, and I'm not trying to get on the women, I'm saying that you mentioned that I can't remember the term that you use in terms of protecting the ideas or something in regards to the plantation itself. Many, and I don't want to misquote, so I got to go back and listen so I can be correct in what I'm saying. But many of the things, because you're talking about being practical and taste, many of the things I find that men do, it is to please the partners that they are with. Because many men, I can tell you, eh, I could have a dish in here, like a dish, a fork and a pot and a couch. I could live very practically. Let me put it like that. But to a partner, to a female person, women like to beautify. So you have to add things to that. You have to make these things pretty. You have to make these things pleasant, comfortable. What they define as comfortable. And in doing that, you dig deeper and deeper, because I don't make furniture. I don't make Mercedes Benz. I don't make these things. So I become enslaved to all these corporations and companies because I am trying to please the partner I'm with and making her comfortable because she has particular tastes. Now, how do you disabuse people? Now, I'm not. I don't want to make this a female or a male thing because men have these tastes as well. But how do you disabuse people in terms of the taste that we have developed over the years and years and living on a quote unquote plantation. How do you disabuse a person and say you could live more practically and still enjoy your life? I guess it's enjoying and doing, but needless to say, that's a question I have for you.
One of the things that helped me on my journey was I began to enjoy leisure arts like cross stitching and knitting and different things that I would find that I could make beautiful myself by my own hand. So while I still have to go because I can't create my own skins of yarn and I can't create my own thread. It lowered the impact or the amount of money that I was putting into the economy because I'm just buying yarn and thread, I'm buying needles, I'm buying cross stitch patterns, I'm buying different things to make my home beautiful versus going to the furniture store to buy their pre-made furniture, or I'm going to Home Goods to buy their pre-made patterns that everybody has in their houses. So we can begin to see beauty in the things that we can create ourselves. We can begin to scale back and scale down the different things that we want. You can begin to look at and just show them the actual differences between the driving and handling on a Mercedes Benz and their comparable lower end vehicle, like a Ford or some other vehicle. So, you begin to see the beauty in the things you can make yourself and in the lower end vehicles so that they can begin to say, well, maybe I don't need a brand. Maybe I don't need to buy the brand. Maybe I don't need to buy into this idea that I have to have the best this or the best that, the most branded car, the most branded clothes, the most branded furniture, the most branded pots and pans. Maybe there are some things I can do for myself, and maybe I'll get a sense of accomplishment, and maybe I'll get a sense of achievement out of that. And you begin introducing those ideas to them slowly but surely until they are gradually unchained to this capitalistic system or to this system that is a plantation that keeps wanting to dig them deeper and deeper into that hole.
Well, this is something we work on. You know,
Hmm.
we as a community, this is something that we continue to work on. I love the fact that you said that you sat down with your niece one time, I guess, explaining to her money and
Hmm.
how that works, because we're not only trying to create a society, we're trying to create smarter people as well. You know, so it's a work, man. It's a work. And you, like you say, I always tell, you know, people who I'm around, how do you eat an elephant? Bite, 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 bite. And I think that
Right.
through the process or a series of taking different kinds of bites, you will find you will be able to eat that big elephant over a period of time. You know, but I, like I say, I appreciate you, matron, man. I appreciate the talk, I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate the reading. And I'll just leave it there for the night.
Well, I appreciate you, Bawana Haguziki. Thank you so much for tuning in. I want to thank KW Don 7, the Forecast, Sister Raw, and the elders, and everyone else that tuned in to listen. I know Anthony McPhail is listening. I know Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening, and so many others. I know Redo 9002 is listening as well. And you, dear listener, yes, you. I appreciate and value each and every one of you. And I will be back on Thursday, May 7th, with chapter 4. We're almost done with this book. It's only 5 short chapters. And when we're done, we're going to talk about this and move on to our next book. I'm thinking that it might be Burn Down the Master's House. I'm thinking that we might read Burn Down the Master's House. All right. I will see you next time. Peace, guys.